All right, so looks like it's going to be a busy day today. We've got somewhat of a complicated thing working, and I'll try to break it down for you for those of you in different parts of this of our county warning area, so you can kind of understand when you might be impacted and when your biggest threat is and what your biggest threat is. Um, so, a couple main messages. I'll start with the Northwest. The Northwest most recently was upgraded to a moderate risk, and I'll show that in a minute. The primary reason is because the risk for tornadoes, particularly strong tornadoes, is there and increasing. Therefore, they had enough evidence and data to support going to a moderate risk. Large hail, 2-inch in diameter or greater, is also possible in the moderate risk zone and the areas around that, in addition to damaging winds. But we do think that tornadoes and large hail are going to be your primary risk for tonight. The risk really starts to increase after 6, plus or minus an hour, but we're favoring a little bit later with this because it's going to be mainly associated with the line in the actual cold front as it's coming in later tonight. And as it does so, we have a low-level jet and all these other stronger winds that are coming in just off the surface just after sunset. And so we think that's when the biggest threat will be, but there are some models that are a little bit faster than others, and that's why I'm saying 6 o'clock here and giving you a little bit of leeway. But it does look like it's an evening into the late night. For the oops, that's a typo on there. That should be Central Georgia. Central Georgia has a slight to enhanced risk. And in fact, the enhanced was expanded south and east, as was the risk for strong tornadoes into this region. I can also draw on here a little bit. The enhanced risk was expanded all the way down to Columbus, to Macon, and then out towards Athens. So the enhanced risk area was this region here. And again, it's because we have the threat for some storms coming in this afternoon into the early evening time, more isolated in nature. But what we think is going to happen with the afternoon risk is that it's not going to be associated with the line per se, but more isolated to scattered severe. And that risk will increase after 3 as storms start to develop. And again, that's plus or minus an hour, favoring 4 to 8, but more scattered and not like in a solid line. The tornado risk really isn't there this afternoon and doesn't increase until, again, after sunset when we start to get those stronger winds aloft in. So Central Georgia, your initial risk is going to be damaging winds and large hail. And then the tornado risk will increase through the evening hours as the stronger winds start to come in. So what's causing it? We have a warm front currently back over northern Mississippi, central Alabama, and down in, just south of Columbus. That warm front's going to be working to the northeast. In fact, there's one really strong storm in Mississippi, northern Mississippi right now. For those of you in North Georgia, you'll have to watch this one. Whether it holds together and comes into northwest Georgia or not, hard to say. But it's basically riding east along the warm front and on a due east fashion. And again, it sort of signifies the edge of that really warm, moist air in what we call the warm sector south of the warm front. But that warm front's going to be advancing through the day to the northeast. The other thing that's kind of tricky, and this is where I say it's tricky forecast, some of the models are trying to hold in some cooler surface air up in the northeast Georgia. And so it's kind of keeping the instability out of northeast Georgia and out of the warm sector. And so somewhere this warm front, let me change my pink color to red, somewhere this warm front is going to come up and sort of wind and end up. And that's kind of what the models are hinting at. In what configuration it looks like or how far north and west it gets is really hard to say, but that will delineate where sort of the haves and the have-nots and where the risk really diminishes pretty quickly. And you'll see that in their outlooks. They sort of try to carve the enhanced risk out along to delineate that. Doesn't mean there won't be a hail risk and damaging wind risk up there, but when we start to separate from the surface, really moist air, we start to lose that tornado threat in the northeast, even though there is a lot of wind shear. So the northeast Georgia is really tricky. Central Georgia, you guys are going to be in the warm sector probably first, and that's why we're going to see maybe some isolated storms developing this afternoon across that region. And again, I'll time that out for you in a minute. And then really the cold front is what gets is really your main risk in northwest and western Georgia tonight, this afternoon, or this evening and tonight. Sorry. Let me move on. So the general outlook area, this is the upgraded to moderate risk that SBC went to here in the last 20 minutes. You can see everything west of 75 and basically along and north of 20 is now in the moderate risk. And again, that's sort of that area where we're fairly certain of high instability and really high wind shear. In the enhanced risk region, you can see what I was talking about on the last slide, where they've sort of carved in from the northeast a little bit, trying to delineate where that instability really starts to drop off. But the enhanced risk area does include all of Atlanta, goes all the way over to Athens, back down to Macon and Columbus, and gets up into the north central Georgia mountains, and then the northeast mountains are sort of in that slight risk region. So anyone in the enhanced risk up into the moderate risk will have a risk for significant severe weather, and I'll show that here on the next slide. Well, first I'm going to show you talk about what the risk areas mean. And so when you see these risks, for those of you that don't follow them, it's really a scale from 0 to 5, where 0 is just general thunderstorms, your typical stuff we see in the summertime, are not associated with anything severe. And then they work up through the severity scale to the point where we're at today, where we have an enhanced and a moderate. And when you start talking in the enhanced and the moderate, you're talking more on the outbreak or significant severe weather. In fact, when they upgraded to the 4, you can see level 4, moderate risk, long-lived, widespread, and very intense. And so they don't happen too often each year. The last one we had was the April 5th last year, high risk day, where we had significant tornadoes in South Georgia. So again, it doesn't happen often. And when it does happen, the threat is pretty significant. So we all need to pay attention to weather, especially on those days. One thing that Storm Prediction Center does on day 1 is they break down a risk by chance or probability. And what you see here, and again, we don't see it very often, but they've highlighted a 15% region, basically delineating where the moderate risk is. That 15% is a 15% chance of a tornado within 25 miles of any point in that area. So it may not sound like a lot, but compared to any given day, it's a order of magnitude increase in the threat. And so when we see numbers like that, that's a pretty significant number, even though it doesn't sound like, you can't relate it to like chance of rain or anything. But the other thing to note here is the hatched black area, the black outline or the black hatched area. That is where, given the combination of the instability in the atmosphere and the wind shear, the chances for strong to violent tornadoes exists. And so you can see here, that's basically the enhanced risk region that I was talking about on the last slide. You have an increased chance that if you do have a tornado, that it has a strong chance of becoming a strong or violent tornado, which is an EF2 or greater. So obviously the tornado risk is the key thing we need to hone in on today. And I don't want to diminish the tornado risk in the 5% region. On any other day, that's a really high risk. But the focus, at least for initially, is in that enhanced to the northwest. But we could still see some anywhere basically in the state of Georgia, given the 5%. And it all depends on how things play out with the line and with the isolated stuff that develops later today. In terms of large hail, anytime we get supercells, and that's what we're talking about today, getting our supercells, large hail is always a risk. They've highlighted, again, northwest, 30% chance. That's a 1 in 3 chance of any one point within 25 miles of any one point in that sector gets could see large hail or severe hail. The black delineated area is where large hail chances are greatest, which would be greater than 2 inch. And so that's golf ball is 1 3/4 for reference, and tennis ball is 2.5. So somewhere in that neighborhood, pretty large hail. So let's talk about round one. And this is where things are a little tricky and models are having a hard time developing because it's really in association with that warm front as it moves back over us. What you're looking at here are two different model simulations at the exact same time. And what they're showing, and if you look at the top left graphic, it's showing some isolated storms developing between 4 and 6 p.m. And what they will be doing is tracking east through either central Georgia, southern Georgia, eastern Georgia. This particular model's got them all over the place, but not nearly as widespread a coverage as the model on the bottom right. If you look at the bottom right graphic, that's another local model that we run, high-res model. You can see it's got more coverage of storms across central Georgia and even some up in the I-20 corridor. They would be isolated. They would probably be severe. Large hail. In the further north and west you go, the greater the tornado risk is during this isolated, we'll call it severe time frame between, say, 4 and 6 p.m. So hail and winds are the main threat early, and then again, the tornado threat increases both with time and the direction as you head north and west. And that window primarily looks to be anytime after 4 through 8 p.m. And so we may start seeing them plus or minus, an hour through 8 o'clock in that isolated time frame. We get into round two, and I'll let this load. This is another model run, and what I want you to do is notice both time frames across central Georgia. You'll see some of the isolated stuff develop, and then move off to the east, and you can see it has a completely different coverage look than the other one. For it to load, give it a second. There we go. This one will load again. You'll see storms developing in central Georgia as isolated storms, and then shifting east. Those would become severe. Can't rule out tornadoes with them, but the real tornado threat looks like it's going to be, again, further north and west, closer to that line as that line's coming in. And I'll let it play one more time. You can see the timing. This one's a little bit slower. It brings the line into the northwest around 10 o'clock. This could be as early as 8, we're thinking, back up in the northwest with the more isolated severe stuff later this afternoon into the evening hours. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch with the stuff over central and western Georgia late to early evening, late afternoon, early evening, and then the main line as that's coming in much later tonight. And in talking to Storm Prediction Center, they're really concerned about this line coming in, and especially with the winds that are going to be associated with that. And for good reason. There's some of the highest numbers I've seen in a while in terms of winds. So talking about the line timing combined with the other risk, here's sort of a timing graphic we've created for you. So northwest Georgia, 8 to 10, sort of getting into that, say, south of Rome up towards Blairsville time frame. You're looking at 10 to midnight, plus or minus, and then into the metro down the I-85 corridor, midnight-ish to 1 a.m. And then it's really difficult to tell whether or not the line's going to hold together and remain severe. But if it does, you would be looking at middle of the night time frame, say 3 a.m. from Columbus up towards Eatonton, and then out. And then after 5 a.m. Would be down, say, Americus down to Dublin. That's a rough time frame. And then again, the area I've highlighted in the circle would be the isolated severe 4 to 8, with a lower tornado risk early, increasing in time. So if you get any isolated stuff into the evening hours, that's when the winds are starting to increase as the main upper level system is moving in. And again, you can see I've taken 2 snapshots here. One is at 7 p.m. Tonight. You can see the isolated severe in the bottom right. And again, don't pay any attention to the exact location. Some models are all over the place on where these things would be. But the main point is that they're targeting sort of that south of 20 down into central Georgia area. And then late tonight with the line as it's coming in across the west and northwest. And so that's sort of your round 3 or round 2, round 3, with round 1 being early this morning. And we did have a hail report out of LJ here with that one isolated cell that is moving across them now. So hail does look like it's going to be a problem today. Some terms you may hear that we need you to understand if they should occur today. The first is PDS watch. What that stands for is particularly dangerous situation. It's used by the Storm Prediction Center when the severity of the storms in that watch zone could be on the extreme side, meaning either extreme winds or strong to violent tornadoes. And that's the only time that we'll use that watch, when the likelihood of strong to violent tornadoes are in that watch during that time frame. So if you hear that, and if you're in a PDS watch, you need to pay particular attention, because we're talking sort of on the upper end of whatever severe storms we're talking about. Radar observed tornado. If we see debris, and sometimes we can see debris on radar when a tornado is on the ground, because it lofts the debris into the atmosphere. And we will use that term when that's the case, when we see and are certain that we're seeing debris on radar. And we may use it in cases where we don't actually have somebody sighting it with their own eyes. So it may be dark, but we can see it on radar. You need to obviously treat a radar observed tornado the same as you would an observed tornado, because we're actually seeing lofted debris. And sometimes that debris can get as high as 12, 15, 18, 20,000 feet or higher. And when that's the case, we know that from past cases that we're dealing with a strong to violent tornado when debris reaches certain altitudes. And then the other term you may hear is if you hear tornado emergency, and that is when we are certain that a strong to violent tornado is on the ground. We will use the term tornado emergency within the tornado warning. And sometimes we'll use the radar to actually help us confirm that based on how high it's lofting the debris. So just wanted you to be aware, in case you hear those terms, what they mean, and have an understanding of what those terms mean, since we don't use them that often. So in summary, northwest Georgia, obviously the moderate risk, tornadoes, some strong with the large hail damaging winds. The risk really starts to increase after 6. But we are looking, as we go in time, we are favoring later with the risk, the greatest risk. Again, that's a typo on that. It should be Central Georgia, slight and then enhanced risk with tornadoes possible primarily later and primarily on the northern edge of that. So Columbus to Macon to Athens, you guys are in that hatched area within the enhanced risk. So we obviously can't rule them out. It's just hard to tell when the timing is going to be greatest for you, because the winds come in a little bit later for you. Large hail, obviously 2-inch plus, and that's particularly the western side of that area. So say west of 75, the large hail threat is greater, and then obviously damaging winds. So that's really all we have. Not under a watch or anything yet. I would anticipate that kind of a thing to come out later today, but in fact, that's one of your questions. Best guess on timing. Depending on what's happening to the west and when what they're seeing on satellite, if they're seeing the atmosphere destabilize, they'll start with the watches. Central Georgia is going to be tricky because we're banking on storms developing in the afternoon, and so it's a function of when we think that development's going to occur, and then what kind of watch we're going to put Central Georgia in based on whether or not there's enough wind shear for a tornado watch, or it's going to be severe thunderstorm for large hail. So Central Georgia is a little trickier on what kind of watch you may get. You may end up being in 2 types, because it's entirely possible you go into a severe thunderstorm watch early in the afternoon through the evening, and then if the line's moving in, you may end up, and it's moving fast enough to capture some of the instability, you may end up going into a tornado watch late. And so it's really hard to say. Northwest Georgia, I would anticipate tornado watches. Just hard to say when, but I wouldn't expect it until much later.